Have you ever had your heart broken? Today, we're going to be exploring breaking up and what happens when we lose somebody from our lives. If you'd like to find out more about how to improve your relationships, head over to therelationshipmaze.com. If you'd like to find out more about this podcast, head over to therelationshipmazepodcast.com and press subscribe right now. Welcome to today's podcast, and today we're going to be talking about heartbreak.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about what happens or what it's like to experience the ending of a relationship. And of course, it's one of these experiences that I would imagine probably all of us have experienced at some point in our lives. So it's one of these life experiences that you have, like leaving home, for example, or going off to work, or experiences that all of us have to go through at some point in our life. And I think it's really important to also mention that a breakup, the ending of a relationship, that's something that can happen at any stage in your life. You might think you're done with that when you're in a relationship with your partner, and hopefully that will be, hopefully that will last forever and will bring you a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment. But of course, relationships can break up, and they sometimes can break up quite late. I mean, they can break up in their 60s, for example, or 70s. We're working with clients who've split up in their 80s. So you just never know. Yeah. So I think I want to kind of normalize this experience. It can happen to you at any stage in your life when you thought, well, I'm over this. I'm never going to experience this.
And it's not always just through breaking up, somebody leaving. I mean, it can also be through loss as well. So the death of a loved one, which does have some similarities. I mean, there are differences too, but there are also a lot of similarities in the process that we go through with grief, with loss.
Yeah, and we will talk about this in a bit more detail, the stages of grief. But I think it's kind of just worth emphasizing how absolutely devastating this experience is. And you can have an experience, it doesn't have to be a long-term relationship. It can also be that you have met someone, you've dated for a while, for a few months or so, and then this person disappears. They just disappear suddenly, or they disappear with some indicators previously that showed that maybe there was trouble ahead. And it can really be absolutely devastating and so painful. So it's not, there's a good reason why we've got all these songs about love, about hearts aching, or we've got lots of songs about it, we've got sort of literature and poetry about it. This is something that we're all familiar with. It's and it's written about or talked about because it's so hard, isn't it? So painful.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly painful, and like Angela said, it's unlikely it won't affect all of us at some point. No. I mean, it's something with heartbreak. It's something that even the thought of this as well. I hope not to have to go through it again. It's a very painful thing.
Yeah, and it's just. It can actually, I mean, we just looked it up before we did this podcast. We looked up, we Googled whether a broken heart is a thing physiologically, so to speak, because obviously psychologically, emotionally it is. You have this sensation of, of your world falling apart, being devastated. But it actually is also, it can be a medical condition. So it can literally, really at the extreme end of it, and I think it's quite rare, it can literally cause very severe heart problems, which are not dissimilar to a heart attack or a stroke. So the symptoms are quite similar. So you might actually experience the breakup as something that literally affects your heart in quite a significant way.
Yeah, you really feel it in your body, and whether or not you do in your body, for many people it's going to affect you, your health, your emotional health, your mental health, and can have a huge impact on your work, your other relationships, your ability to really function properly. So it's such a key thing to kind of understand a little bit more about breaking up, or what happens when we lose the other person in some way. And having that understanding can help you as well with part of that process. And I think one of the things is that there is no quick solution. So we all want we want it to be over, or in the case of a breakup, we often may want the other person back, or you know, it can be difficult for the person who initiates a breakup too. But I think often for the person who's on the receiving end, it can be more challenging, and they, you know, there's that also letting go of that sort of hope that maybe you can rebuild something can be very difficult as well. Which is different from when somebody dies, where, you know, that has gone. Whereas with a breakup, there's also the fact that that other person is still there somewhere.
Sorry, before I lose my train of thought on this, I was just going back to what you just said, Tom, about just to be clear that I think the breakup can be difficult for both partners, the one who initiates the breakup as much as for the one who's actually hit by it. Both can be quite badly affected by the loss. But I think there is another dimension, isn't there, for the person who's left behind, who is being broken up with, because there's often this sense of shame that comes with it, this sense of being rejected or being abandoned, and a sense of helplessness with it. It's something that was beyond your control, maybe, so to speak. It might not have been your choice. So therefore you might feel it more acutely. I'm kind of stating the obvious here. But I think that's why it's often harder to be left behind, so to speak. And of course, it can trigger some old experiences as well. We'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about breakup as a form of grieving.
Yeah, and some people that I know, in fact, a relation of mine many years ago was basically he was in his 70s, I think, and his wife actually just suddenly decided she didn't want a relationship anymore, and he had no idea. It was a complete shock. He had no idea that there was any problem, that anything was wrong. Just that sort of shock. And and like you said, it can be difficult for both people. I don't know, in my experience in the past, I'm not sure, like, if somebody splits up with me, I'm not sure it really seemed that difficult for them, but
I'm sure it was. That's just your projection there.
That's probably just a projection, So
I think it's hard. It's hard. I mean, actually, sorry, there was something that's what I wanted to pick up on, was the point about it can be a shock, but I think a lot of the time, particularly in longer term relationships, it's a slow process. It's a slow build up. Endings usually, from my experience, don't come completely out of the blue. They can do sometimes with an affair or something like that. But there's usually often a sort of a build-up. There are problems that continue over a long period of time. There might be a lot of conflict in the relationship that is either voiced or is gone underground. So there might be a lot of silence around the difficulties in the relationship. But usually relationships break up for a reason, so to speak. And the breakup often is related to both partners' contribution to difficulties in the relationship. That's in sort of more longer term relationships. When they're sort of short term, then it's often that there's an ending because very often after the honeymoon period is over, that often happens, that there's a realization, well, actually we are not quite the people that we thought we were, and one partner decides, well, I can't be asked to fix this, so to speak. This is too much. It's best to walk away. And of course, the more recent experience that we've talked about in previous podcasts as well is this experience of being ghosted. So this heartache that you experience with someone who you build some hope with, and they just disappear. They're just out of thin air. And of course, that can be incredibly, well, maybe not quite so heartbreaking if you haven't been that attached to the person yet, but heartbreaking in the sense of leaving you ashamed, as I say, and leaving you worried about what's wrong with me.
Yeah, and I think also picking up on what you said is that, you know, some people do get addicted to that honeymoon period. They get addicted to that rush of the passion, of the things that go with that early stages of a relationship. And when that changes, which it does for most people, it's sort of, you know, then some people, for them, they think there's something wrong with a relationship. And, you know, I don't know how that's changed over internet dating. I did read something somewhere recently that suggested that maybe more people are not actually committing past that stage because they think something's wrong, because you get used to that sort of, that rush. But actually, that sometimes it's working through that, as we talked about before, that leads to more fulfilling relationships. So there's many different reasons that people do break up, as you all know, listening.
Yeah, of course. But sorry, we talked over each other. Yeah, but what we thought we'd talk about a little bit in terms of giving you a sort of theoretical model, so to speak, to kind of understand what happens when you experience the end of a relationship and the heartache that ensues. Is a model that has been developed by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. That's from the 1969. She wrote a very seminal book on death and dying, where she described different stages of grief. And her model has been revised now. I mean, there are more sort of contemporary forms of that, and more contemporary forms around the model of grieving and bereavement. But I think it's quite a useful model to think about when we think about the end of a relationship. So we'll just briefly sort of talk you through these 4 stages that she talks about. Do you want to start with the first one?
Yeah, so the first stage is denial. So this is this sense of, disbelief about what's happening. So, often this is about putting off the grief because we still have hopes that things will work out. So particularly with a breakup, when the other person is still somewhere around, because it's different with death, where that is more permanent, but there's still that sense of denial. But this sort of not wanting to accept that the thing has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can't quite really make sense of this yet. You haven't quite processed it. It seems a bit unreal somehow. And there is a part of you that still believes, I think, I'll wake up tomorrow and surely this didn't happen and we're back on track. We're back together. This relationship is going to start again. So that's the sort of first experience, denial. And then following denial is often a period of anger. That's the second stage, the anger about this situation that you find yourself in, anger with this previous partner who has abandoned you. So you often play through your mind all these kind of scenes where they've said something or done something that was really deeply upsetting for you. Or the anger might also turn inward sometimes. It might be an anger where you're angry with yourself. Oh, I really messed this one up. I should have done this. I should have said that. So you might berate yourself in this period of anger as well. So it's this frustration about the situation overall as well. Why am I in this situation again? Yeah, might be something that it plays out in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, it could be anger at other people around, like family members too. Yeah. So it might blame the family, saying, well, it's because of their family, because of their parents, which, sometimes is the case.
Well, yeah, because they interfere too much. Or you might be angry for friends. They were friends because of the sense of, well, they weren't present enough for me to help me with this. And where are my friends now to help me? So anger is a sort of pervasive experience in this phase of the grieving.
Yeah, and then we'd move on to the next stage, which is bargaining. So bargaining is that sort of sense of negotiation and thinking, when you split up with someone, you get to that point where you think, well, let's be friends. We can continue as friends. Or even bargaining with, some it might turn to prayer or kind of trying to bargain with a higher power that hopefully, if I pray enough, then maybe we can kind of rebuild something or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the next period, that's the depression sets in. That's when you kind of put on all the soppy records and listen to some sad songs again and again. Well, some of you, that's what I used to do in the past. Or you watch some sad movies or something like this. And you're really feeling, this is the sort of sinking into this period. And actually, I shouldn't be smiling about that because it's a really terrible experience. It's this sort of sinking into this really deep-seated sadness about the reality of the situation, so to speak, where you realize, well, really, this person is gone. They're not in my life anymore. All these things that we were planning to do together, we were going to go on holidays, we were going to go to the theatre together, we were going to do all these really exciting and lovely things together. That's not going to happen now, or certainly not with this person. So this deep seated sadness that you experience.
Yeah, and although you say, you know, when the reality sets in, I think sometimes it's not just reality, it's also distortion, because it's often at this point, we, like you said, we start to think of all of these great things we could do, all of these wonderful times that we had, and we'll never have them again. So we kind of imagine, we remember those times that were really great, and then we kind of go into the future and think, now we're not going to have those again, we're not going to have those again because that person's no longer with us. But the distortion is that we tend, at that point, we don't think about all of the awful times that we had with them. So we just very selectively filter out those things that essentially were good, and then think about how we won't have them again. Yeah. So it really is a distortion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then finally, the fifth stage is acceptance, and this can take some time. So it's not a fast process to go through these. So, you know, it's not days, it's not weeks, it's usually months. For some people, you know, it could be a couple of years. So, you know, this can take time. And in fact, it does take time. So to get to that point of acceptance where you accept that, you know, what has happened, and you're able to then kind of move on with life. And of course, as well, with acceptance, there may still always be a little kind of sadness within you when you think about that breakup.
Absolutely.
You know, and that may never go sometimes. I mean, I think particularly when somebody dies, and also knowing that that's okay, because that's sort of, you know, when somebody has died, for example, it's that memory, because we have loved them and we do love them. Yeah.
So that grief is not going to go away. Absolutely. Yeah, I think what's also relevant in this kind of model and thinking about these sort of different phases, that they're not necessarily linear, and it doesn't mean just because you've worked through the model, so to speak, and you're now at the fifth stage of acceptance, that you can't move back into a depressive phase, for example, where you get really overwhelmed with these feelings, the old feelings again, and this sense of loss for what could have been with your partner and what was in the past, or that you can't get through angry stages. So it's not a linear model, just to be clear about it, you know, that you can go back, so to speak, into these different stages. So this model is really just it gives you a sort of rough timeline and highlights the process that we're going through with grief, which is, of course, what we are experiencing when we lose someone who we really loved, either to death or to separation.
Yeah, and it's really important. I think one of the key things is having an understanding that this is totally normal, that when you break up, when somebody breaks up with you, when you break up with somebody, these processes that you go through are completely normal and natural.
Yeah.
And that's, so, you know, if you feel that you're in this depressive stage for some time, well, this is a normal part of what happens. So there's nothing wrong with your being in this stage. It's just, it's working through that and allowing yourself to have that time to do that, because it does take time. And if you try and stop the process, if you try and ignore it, then although we might kind of be able to get on with things, it's at some level, it's like you've got these feelings that are kind of trapped within you, like a bottle of fizzy drink that's getting shaken up and getting more and more pressure within it until it's ready to explode. And I've seen this with people where you know, they've tried to kind of put off the grief, and even years later, suddenly, when they think they've been through this, it's like they explode, and it kind of comes from this grief they haven't had time to work through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also what's maybe relevant within the context of this discussion is that there is something in our profession that we call complex grief, which is when you have lost someone, that loss can be compounded because it might bring up some older losses that you've had in your life, some former losses that you had in your life. And if you've had a lot of loss in your life, then it gets bigger, so to speak. So then you are grieving in these moments, not just the one relationship that has just ended, but also maybe past relationships that you haven't quite processed yet, that kind of come up. It makes it bigger, so to speak, than it actually is. It is bigger for you. So there is a sort of conflation, so to speak, of what's past and present. And if you have a sense that this grief, this separation, or this ending is absolutely overwhelming you, for a long period of time, then it might be an indication that you might be mourning not just the loss of this one person, but also of previous people significant people you've lost in your life, previous partners, parents, siblings, for example. So that's where it gets a little bit more complicated, so to speak. And if you have this experience that you get very flooded by overwhelming and crushing sadness and depression, then it might also be time to maybe seek some help and explore this a little bit further in therapy.
Yeah, and I think also your attachment style is going to affect how you experience loss as well.
Absolutely.
To a large extent. So, you know, and some people who are anxiously attached, it may be that even when their partner goes away for a couple of weeks, it's almost like a loss.
Yes.
So to them, it's like,
Absolutely.
this person's left me, they've been abandoned. So there is a sense of that there. And, you know, in terms of somebody who's more avoidant, you know, breakups, they were, you know, although that may be going on under the surface, actually it may seem that they're then dealing with this without much effort, without much going on.
They minimise kind of any expression of grief. Absolutely. Yeah, that's true. So your attachment style will also play into this, the way that you process this grief and the loss. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So in terms of, yes, what can you do? Well, I think Tom said already, there isn't really that, it's not that you can do much because you can't change the situation as such. The situation is what it is, and ultimately, of course, you do come to a form of acceptance that, you know, the situation cannot be changed. So that's kind of what you're working towards. But there is something around maybe being able to distract yourself a little bit from this situation. And I think from the grieving, because I think only sitting at home and listening to sad records for weeks and months on end is probably not going to be very helpful. And it's sort of forcing you to get stuck in this dynamic, in the grieving process as well.
Yeah, you need to watch some sad movies as well as listen to the records.
Yeah, exactly.
So think about ways you can distract yourself, keep active. I think one important thing as well is if you try and stay friends with a person too quickly, that can make it very difficult. It can be really important to make space.
I would
so if your feelings are still very strong for that person, if you're feeling that there's some sense of hope as well, but that it's being clear there isn't, then it's probably the most useful thing to take some space, even if it's for some time. So sort of email contact, physical contact. You know, trying to be friends too soon can be really difficult.
I'm not sure that it's even possible.
No.
What do you think?
No, well, I know some people that seem to do that, and I've always thought, how do they do that? It's not something that I'm familiar with myself, but
it's a very different relationship, isn't it? A romantic relationship is different from a friendship. I mean, there are elements of friendship in a romantic relationship, but it's kind of negotiating a different kind of contract, so to speak, about the relationship. And I'm not saying it's not possible, but it can be quite challenging and difficult to do so. Yeah,
and I think very frequently what happens is one person, you know, you want to stay friends, but for at least one of the people, there's often that hope that I can stay friends because then we can rebuild something.
Yeah, particularly if you're still sort of in the early stages.
Yeah, in the early stages. So it's really important to, I think, to get space from that person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, well, I mean, obviously, you know, we are in the business of talking. That's our bread and butter. We are great believers in that externalizing, so taking it out, taking whatever's in here out there can be helpful. So talking to your friends about it, sharing some of your experiences, also sharing some of your sadness might be quite helpful to process your grief more effectively. Yeah,
and do things for yourself. So go see a film, but not just sad films. So that's the thing is, don't just put on the sad music, the sad films. Go and do some activities, sports, go see films, go to concerts. Again, not just the things that make you feel sad, but things that might make you feel better as well. So think about things that you can do for yourself that maybe you couldn't always do when you were with the other person as well.
Yeah. So there are, I think, in a nutshell, I don't think there are any sort of quick fixes here. It's allowing yourself the time to grieve, noticing if it goes on for a very long period of time, and I'm sort of deliberately not putting a time frame on it, but noticing if it takes up a lot of the space in your life for a long period of time, then it might be time to actually seek some help.
Yeah, and one of the things as well is don't try to bottle it away. Don't try to hide it. Don't try to fight it. Don't deny the feelings. Allow yourself to find space to just have those feelings. Because when you try and fight feelings, we push them away and then try and push back. When we just allow ourselves to know that actually, you know, this feeling feels awful, at the same time, allowing yourself to have that feeling can allow that feeling to begin to process and work through. And the more that you try to stop that, the longer it's going to take at the end to actually get through the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you have that feeling, it's telling you something. It's just telling you that you're distressed, and that's just normal under the circumstances.
Yeah. And emotions are really like waves. You know, they start from nothing, they go to a peak, and they do then begin to fade away. So even though that emotion might feel like it's going to last forever, it won't. And allowing yourself to basically just let that emotion run its course will help it to kind of run its course, usually quicker than if you try and kind of speed it up or stop it somehow.
Do you think that some meditation practice might be helpful here? In this context, I'm not so sure.
Well,
so the idea of kind of, you know, one of the meditation practices around watching clouds in the sky kind of go by. Do you think that would be helpful?
Well, I think the only thing with that is if you start to go inside and think about all of those times that were good, because that's another thing is also, you know, taking time to remember some of those times that weren't so good. So, you know, think about actually what weren't you able to do? What were kind of the things you didn't like that the other person did? So being more realistic about those memories that sometimes we suppress when we, you know, when we have a breakup, we just remember those good things.
Yeah.
One thing once someone described was to imagine that those feelings that are uncomfortable, it's like that wave, and imagine that you're surfing that wave. So imagine that you're kind of riding that wave and just knowing that that wave will begin to pass. You know, even with breathing, sort of just slowing your breathing down, imagine that wave just passing through, being able to kind of ride that wave as it kind of takes its course. Some people find that helpful.
Okay.
Great.
Good. I think we've come to the end here, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thanks for listening today, and please press subscribe and tune in to next week's podcast.
Looking forward to seeing you then. Take good care. Bye.